This request was kind of a mixed request. A couple people asked me to look at X-Men Apocalypse. One person asked me to look at the entire X-Men series. And per my own rules, I don't do franchises based on a singular request, simply because of a time and money investment thing. It's involved in going and looking into an entire series. I only acquiesced to, for example, Metal Gear Solid and Zelda as a result of many, many people requesting it, for example. So, just giving you a heads up on that. That being said, I wanted to do a quick, brief look of the X-Men series thus far, just the movies. Now, I've been a fan of the comics for a little bit, since late 80s, I'd say, as far as the X-Men comics. But I have to be completely honest, the X-Men comics never actually caught me until a comic book series called The Age of Apocalypse. I'm not kidding. That was what really got me into the X-Men franchise specifically. There are other comics that I followed and was a fan of prior to that. But it's so when the X-Men movie was first announced, I don't remember the year, I didn't bother looking it up, doesn't matter. When the X-Men movie was first announced, I was pretty excited about it, and I remember talking with all my friends at the time, who do you think they'll present it with, or how they'll do this, and then we found out it's going to be Magneto, which made sense, but then we're like, oh, who's going to be the next villain, and we were all in agreement, the first movie is Magneto, the second movie is Sinister, and the third movie is Apocalypse. Obviously, that's of course what they're going to do, right? As history has proven me incredibly wrong. Although I find it funny that the third movie in a trilogy of X-Men was Apocalypse, so in a very roundabout way, I was eventually right on that one. But the X-Men series, so let's talk about the first movie. The first movie had some great performances by Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, because both of them are great actors. They managed to add some real weight to the roles, which I think was very essential, because there wasn't a lot of weight to the first movie, if I'm just being blunt. It felt like a TV show. What I mean by that is it felt very small. I didn't feel the scope or the stakes, or in any sense, the greater world in which it was taking place in, which is usually what movies are, in my opinion, of course, better at. The idea of being able to get across the sweeping scale of work, whereas a television show is usually much more down to earth, right? Of course, these aren't universal, but that's something that movies are better at. X-Men felt like a long episode of a TV series. And it kind of has the problem that comic book movies have always had. So I'm going to pause talking about the first movie for a moment to talk about comic book movies in general. See, comic book movies actually have the exact same problem that science fiction movies have. For the exact same reason, even. Special effects are mandatory, and special effects are expensive. And there's a lot of consequences of those problems that have led to the state of movies today. So back in the day, comic book movies were actually relatively common. X-Men 1 and Spider-Man 1 were not the first ones. They were probably the first really popular and successful ones, but there were quite a few comic book movie attempts before that. Now, to make this clear, what I mean is live-action comic book movies. Drawn, animated comic book movies, that's a completely different animal, because there's so much more you can do with animation than at the time you could do with special effects. Even nowadays, some people would argue, and I would agree with this, that certain things would work better animated than live action. But to continue my point with that, I felt I was watching a decent show or maybe an expensive play when I was watching X-Men 1. Don't mistake this for saying that I didn't like it. I did. I watched it several times in the theater. I still own it to this day. DVD, of course, because, duh. But I never really felt that invested in it. Aside from some spectacular performances, Logan did a great job, actually, while we're on the subject. And, of course, by Logan, I mean Hugh Jackman. But you know what I mean. They're basically the same person at this point, am I right? He did a really good job. He was the portrayal. I mean, to this day, I still, when I think of Logan and the way he acts and the way he talks, I think of Hugh Jackman's performance. I think he pretty much iconified Wolverine. There's a reason he's been in every X-Men movie to date. I'll talk about that later. And then we have, as I said before, Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart both did a wonderful job. And there are a few other decent portrayals. I can't pronounce the name of the woman, Famke or something like that, who played Jean Grey, but I think she did actually a very good job of Jean Grey as well. But overall, it felt just kind of lacking. It felt like something that should have been an animated feature. Now, I mentioned the special effects problem. See, by its very nature, let's talk about this just a little bit. By its very nature, science fiction and comic books both have big, flashy special effects, superpowers and spaceships, the ability to, to look inhuman, as well as to have aliens. These kind of things are integral in most versions of both comic books and science fiction, hence the expense of bringing them to the big screen, or indeed live action in general, regardless of big screen or small screen or even video game. There's always that problem. It is expensive to make things look like that. There's a greater problem that's a result of this, which I'm not going to get into right now. But I think if not for the incredible success of Iron Man 1 and the ridiculous expense of the success of the Avengers, then we wouldn't see nearly as many comic book movies as we are being deluged with right now. But I imagine some of my younger viewers would probably be weirded out, at the very least, to consider that there was a time when the very idea of a comic book live-action movie was ridiculous. X-Men and Spider-Man 1 were both taking a risk. Both of them were very risky ventures that happened to pay off thanks to some fairly good work on the behalf of the people involved. Sam Raimi with Spider-Man actually did a fairly good job of that. And, maybe it wasn't Sam Raimi with Spider-Man 1. I'm not going to say that. I don't remember who it was, but whoever was the director did a pretty good job with Spider-Man 1. Whoever was, Bryan Singer did a pretty good job with X-Men 1, etc., etc. That brings us to X2, though, because X2 is probably, at the very least, tied for, if not among my favorites of the X-Men series. That would, of course, be the one which looked at those problems of a comic book movie and said, okay, let's use those as an advantage. X-Men 2 was fairly smart in the fact that it brought everything down a lot. The effects were still there, but it was more like the effects punctuated scenes here and here and here, and everything else was very strongly character-focused to make sure that you didn't need big special effects. The scenes didn't have lots of big fancy graphics happening, for the most part. Now, of course, they did still have those kind of scenes, but they were there to accent what was already being built upon. There was a lot of really good directing, a lot of really great character stuff. It was the character movie, really. That's why the villain of X-Men 2 was a human being. And arguably, prejudice itself was the enemy of X-Men 2, but you get the idea. And then X-Men 3 bombed. No, actually, in my notes here, I literally just have one note by X3. It says train wreck. And then the Wolverine movies were there, and I will never reference them again for the rest of this video. And then there was First Class. Now, First Class is the other one I really liked. I enjoyed Days of Future Past, don't mistake me. But if you asked me to pick my two favorite X-Men movies, not counting the one we're looking at today, it would be X-Men 2 and First Class. First Class managed to make it feel a little bit more real. Rather than watching a play or a cheap television production or whatever, First Class actually managed to make it feel like this was actually happening, and it did in two big ways. Number one, it brought the powers down quite a bit. While some of those abilities they had are fairly significant and powerful abilities, most of them are fairly small scale. Most of them are individual powers rather than I can lift a city powers. They even did this with Magneto himself. Erik Lehnsherr had trouble being able to move something as simple as a satellite. I felt that was a very smart move on their part. Then, of course, we had Days of Future Past. I did like that movie, don't mistake me. I just don't think it's fantastic. I think it was merely great. But it did have a lot of fluff. But by that point, the MCU had exploded, and so all of a sudden there's this massive push for a different approach to graphics in live-action movies. And they were able to basically push into that movie a lot larger scale effects to make things appear more real. Which brings me to Age of Apocalypse, actually. Now, the thing I find most interesting about Age of Apocalypse, it's the first thought I had. And I mentioned this when I did my discussion of this, however long ago that was now. It's the first X-Men live-action movie that I felt was believable. It's the first one where I felt like it was an X-Men movie. Like I felt these were actually the X-Men with their actual powers, with their actual abilities. It felt more real. And this is, of course, and this is why I did this whole diatribe, this is kind of a byproduct of the MCU and the explosion of how that has changed the movie industry in general, because they can do more than they used to be able to, not just because the technology exists, but because the expertise exists and the demand exists. The budget can be allocated for it, whereas previously people would be like, yeah, maybe we should cut that, that effect. Nowadays people are like, no, you gotta have the effects, because it has been so integrally married in the minds of executives at movie production studios that big, comic book movies have to have big special effects. Same with science fiction, actually. And so there's a lot more budget for the effects, for good and for bad. But that being said, I don't think this movie is just an effects flick, don't mistake me. I'm just saying, that was my very first impression of X-Men Apocalypse. I felt like I was actually seeing all of these mutants and their powers as if those powers actually existed, rather than, someone drops down a little sign that says, and then in this scene, blasts shoot out, Now, this movie definitely has some flaws. There's one entire sequence that just, I get it, but we'll talk about it later. Apocalypse, he's very much a I didn't want to win kind of villain. I've talked about this idea before. Sometimes I defend it, sometimes I don't. But it boils down to a villain who is so good, so strong, so skilled, so intelligent, whatever, that the only way that they can lose is they basically allow themselves to lose. Or that what they define as winning is not what other people define as winning. And that's very much what Apocalypse was in this. I'm actually not going to be talking about Apocalypse himself much until the very end. I want to save all my thoughts about him until the end. But there's several scenes where Apocalypse is basically, it comes off as stupid, even though when you think about it, it does fit with his character. Because he's just like, I could win right now, but yeah. I do have to say that a lot of the powers in this movie are vaguely defined on purpose. I've got a couple of notes here. For example, Scott's I-beams can do a ton of damage, and yet can't take down a cheap, thin metal door at a school. Now, I only bring this up to point out something. This is a movie that clearly, despite the believable factor of the mutant powers, takes a lot of liberal interpretation of those powers, specifically to try and make sure that the plot can go forward. There's several scenes, I'm not going to actually list them all, but there's several scenes, I wrote down several, where the powers work in method A or method B because plot, because it needs to be done for the sake of the movie. There's also, now all of this is stuff that I can excuse, and indeed I do still very much enjoy this movie, if I haven't made that clear. But there's one thing I find just absolutely aggravating to the point of criminal in this movie. The underuse, the misuse or underuse of certain characters. Now everyone's going to know who I'm going to bring up when I say that. There's Psylocke, Storm, Angel, all basically were cameos at best. And there's several other characters who could have been fleshed out a lot more and weren't. But honestly, and I know this sounds weird, but the one I'm going to point to most is Psylocke. Because, well, and I'll talk about it now, because Psylocke has always been an interesting character to me, someone who is very, very skilled, and yet ultimately, in terms of her power output, her raw strength, not her end result strength, is fairly low. So the main reason she can keep up and compete with much larger tier individuals is because she is so good at what she does. We see that in this movie, actually. There's the fact that she is clearly someone who is very deadly and very skilled and very dangerous, and then Apocalypse powers her up. That had me going, oh, awesome! When I'm sitting there in the theater, and I had to turn and explain to my sis why I was so jazzed about that. I was like, imagine, I just told her what I just told her. Imagine someone who is very skilled who suddenly has a lot of power backing that up. Or she's going to be an unholy badass, and then she gets like 2 more scenes. Come on, movie! I mean, she does walk away at the end, franchise building, blah, blah, blah. I also find it very ironic to see a movie that is effectively the end of a trilogy. Really, First Class, Days of Future Past, and Apocalypse are a trilogy of movies, narratively and thematically. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I find it interesting that one of the, if not the biggest name villains of the X-Men franchise ends the trilogy. It's the final villain, but also in many ways starts the franchise, because the X-Men have now actually been formed by the end of this movie, fighting one of the biggest villains they have. It's an interesting twist and way to do it. Of course, some time travel and some studio shenanigans and the MCU had to happen for that to come to pass. But whatever. But I've been putting this off. I'm sorry. Let me take a pause. I had a thing I wanted to start with, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to talk about the movies first or comic book movies. Let me go ahead and address something. I know I've said this before, and I've gotten a lot of flack for this opinion. I don't know if you can hear the thunder. I'd like to say I timed that. I've gotten a lot of flack for this opinion. I don't really mind that much if you stray from the source material in anything. And I know that is a very unpopular opinion. I've actually been told to my face, legitimately, not jokingly, that I don't have the right to consider myself a fan of blah, or a geek, or a nerd, because I don't mind if an interpretive work strays from the source material. Now, to give my full opinion, it's not the changing that doesn't bother me. It's the changing for a good purpose. If you're going to take Mystique and reinterpret her into something new, make it something good. If you make something good of it, okay, I'm okay with that. And I will agree that there's such a thing as a line. Now, I call this the gray line because it moves. It's not actually a hard set line. It's this big morass because it depends on the individual. You decide where that gray line is for you. To explain what I mean, let's say they're doing a new Star Trek The Next Generation. They're not, but let's just assume for a moment. And Jean-Luc Picard is a womanizing drunk who likes to kill people with his bare hands. Now, even if they do something good with that, somehow, in my opinion, that's crossing the line. That's going too far away from the source material. But what I've noticed over the years is the distance, where that gray line is, varies wildly. What for some people is so mild of a change they can't even notice it, for others is completely unacceptable. And I'm not here to lay judgment. But I bring this up because I want to get that boilerplate out of the way. None of the changes in this movie, character-wise, bother me. None of them. I don't think they went too far with any of them. Now, what I do think is that a lot of people don't like how far they went with the characters. And I know that because every single thing I've ever heard about this movie has talked about exactly that point and almost nothing else. All the criticisms I've heard of this movie from most of the reviews I've seen, from most of the people who do personal reviews, like Amazon reviews or whatnot, from individuals who I know and are comic book fans, from people I'm not huge friends with but nevertheless are also comic book fans, and then just discussion forums. Every single thing consistently and repeatedly has said they changed it too much from the source material. They changed it too much from the source material. They changed it too much from the source material. In some cases it was they changed it at all, and that was the complaint. So like I said, where that gray line is, that's up to you. And if you don't want to watch the rest of this video, I totally understand, because like I said, nothing crosses that line for me in this particular movie. I will also say this is probably my favorite interpretation of Apocalypse that I've ever seen. But again, I'm going to talk about him later. Okay, now that I've done that and completely alienated every single comic book fan watching this right now, let's talk about the movie itself. First, I'm going to talk about a couple of generic things. One of the things the movie does often, and I've heard this complained about by people who are not seriously complaining, are making jokes at the movie's expense, is that the movie doesn't explain a lot. It actually goes out of its way not to explain a lot. I've been thinking about what to call this, because I've seen this in movies and in film, and in TV, and in games before. I think I'm going to call it keyhole style. Keyhole glimpses, if you will. In other words, all you're seeing is this. You're seeing just this little bit of something larger. And you can tell from what you can see through this keyhole, bits and pieces of it. You can extrapolate what you're seeing there, but you don't see the whole picture. It's not explained to you. They don't stop the film. Okay, so this guy has this thing and he's doing this. They don't do that. There's a lot of little glimpses as to a larger piece there, and it helps with the world building of this movie. It's part of why I felt this movie was more believable, because there's actually a lot of world building that goes into it, especially in the first act. Now, that brings me to another interesting point. One of the things I've been accused of, personally, to my face, is that I was, what's the word? I can't remember it. Putting my own thoughts onto the movie too much. I can't remember what that's called. My vocabulary fails me. I was accused of doing that all the time, in this movie specifically, that all of that character stuff that I'm reading into the movie wasn't there at all. It was just something that I was imprinting, I guess, upon the movie. I suppose that's a valid possibility, but if my tone doesn't make it clear, I don't think that's true at all. I have a fairly distinct feeling of when I am putting my own thoughts into a character. I've done that many times in many fictional works, where I say, I don't care for the way this works, why don't I redesign it? It's part of that GM philosophy thing that I've talked about before. So I don't think I'm doing that in this case because I don't feel like I am. I have no mental perception of that. Rather, what I am doing is taking this, that's why I talked about it just before, and trying to extrapolate on what else is there. Because they do this with individual characters, not just world building. So let's talk about the movie directly. First of all, the architecture of that pyramid at the beginning is ridiculous. It's one of the stupidest things I see in this movie. But and the very idea that there's like this pyramid, there's all these single stones, support stones that are keeping the pyramid up. I'm not even going to go into that. It's kind of silly and kind of stupid. And every time I see it, I just kind of go, "Are you kidding me? Really? That's how they take it out?" I get the thematic point. The thematic point is that a bunch of ants unified against something stronger in order to defeat it. I've seen A Bug's Life too. I get it. But to counter-argue myself, I wonder how long this particular rebellion has been in place. Because we know people have rebelled against him and betrayed against him regularly. That's mentioned several times throughout the movie, that En Sabanur never really just holds on to power. There's always someone trying to take it from him or usurp him. And so it's entirely possible that this, the most successful attempt that was ever made to betray him, was something that had been planned for a very long time. And you get the impression that maybe they had built this deliberate structural weakness into the place so that they could knock the pyramid down when he was in there. Because how else do you kill something like that but by dropping a pyramid on him? And it kind of worked, so, One thing I also like about this movie in general, and the first scene shows it, is a lot of people, in real life too, have this weird perspective that if you have superpowers, you're suddenly invincible. That's not the case, though. Anybody who really thinks and dissects and analyzes and geeks out about things like comic book powers, capes in general, knows that just because you can shoot incredibly destructive beams out of your eyes, to name one example, doesn't mean you won't die to a knife being stabbed in you in the heart. You don't suddenly gain invulnerability or increased stamina or increased health or whatever just because you have superpowers. And the movie does a lot of good work in showcasing that. Several of the mutants are defeated basically because they are like, ha-ha, powerful stuff, and didn't really use their powers to their fullest extent, and were brought down by something a lot more mundane that would defeat a normal person, too. Now, of course, there are some superpowers that do have increased durability and whatnot. That's a separate thing. But I do like the fact that, for example, Quicksilver, who is arguably the most overpowered mutant in this trilogy, actually, with a couple of exceptions, is brought down because he basically got arrogant about it. He was like, I'm too fast for this guy to keep up. But his leg is freaking broken, for God's sakes. And that stops him from really being a significant threat, because he's still just a guy. Now, although he probably has the speed force, let's be honest with ourselves, because how else could he, endure going like that? So, Scott Summers is a prick for a very little bit of this movie. We get this establishment. We don't really see him being that much of a prick. I think we see one, maybe two lines from him that indicate that he is kind of an asshole. Now, I actually like that, as weird as that sounds. Not only is it the Kirk argument all over again. In other words, Kirk, when he was a kid, was probably a complete, bastard. But it highlights the fact that the only reason he was acting that way was because he was acting out. Because he was the weird one. He was the outcast in school. It's actually very logical to me, I'm skipping ahead of my notes a little bit, that he and Jean hook up. I don't mean romantically, I mean like the two of them have a natural chemistry together and grow closer as friends because of the fact that both of them are very accustomed to being outcasts. Him amongst humans and her amongst mutants. It's a nice touch. I love Nightcrawler. I'm not going to go list every single scene he's in that's amazing. But every scene with Nightcrawler is awesome. He is an absolutely amazing character, and he's played perfectly. I mean, absolutely perfectly. I feel so bad for that kid. We don't even have to go into his big, horrible backstory all that much. It's not necessary. We can tell because he's blue and he's got a tail. That's really all we need to know about how horrible his life must have been up till this point. I am going to wonder how they managed to capture someone like Nightcrawler, but that leads into a fairly large plot holy kind of a thing that I'll talk about later. I want to save that for later. Like I said, I feel for her, or for him. Excuse me. I was just looking at my Storm notes. I think the best portrayal of him, the best scene for him, could be best described as, "Oh, you're not blue. Yeah, neither of you. I'm blue." Just wanting to go on. Of course, he wants to go to the mall too. Storm's actress actually did a fairly good job of Storm. I think it's another one of those underused things. I liked the potential of it. I know. Changed the character. We already discussed this. It didn't bother me how they changed Storm. What I liked was the potential we saw in her first few scenes. Someone who is very, very weak powers. I mean, she can barely conjure up a little bit of a gust of wind. And she's trying to use that to steal off of the streets and failing at it. I like that. I like the Storm that is basically living in the drug of society, living in the gutters. And that kind of fits the kind of personality she would exude in the future. Her whole idealism tainted with massive cynicism kind of a thing. And it helps to inform why she switched sides in the end. That and the angel thing. We'll get to that, though. Here's a bunch of notes about Apocalypse. We'll read those later. Note Angel's immediate escape as soon as the electricity is shut off. I actually like that. It brings to mind the idea of just how long Angel has hated being in here. The way he says, again, Angel's a character that's fairly underutilized, but the way he says, they'll kill us if we don't fight, that helps to inform his character. That helps to show how embittered he's gotten at this point in time, and to give us a personal insight into the plight of these mutants. It's the same input that we can get from other gladiatorial people that we have done in real life to real people. Fight or die. Take your pick. And it's a really messed up situation for basically everyone involved. I do very much like how Mystique once again showcases how skill can trump power in several circumstances. We demonstrate several times how Mystique is really good at what she does, thanks to experience, thanks to practice, thanks to constantly trying to hone herself and be better. I've actually wondered several times where she gets her massive amount of funding from, but for someone who could do what she can do, that's probably not too hard. So I'm going to skip over that section for a bit. I got to ask a question. Why does every X-Men movie that happens to include Professor Xavier, his first teaching scene is always him teaching something that's relevant to the theme of the movie? In this case, he's talking about the old society being brought down and the new society taking up its place. Yeah. I also like how Scott's I-beams are very strong, and they're demonstrated to be very strong, not counting the door situation I just mentioned. That's how it should be. Some people tend to forget that Cyclops, despite having a fairly one-note power, his power is really, really strong. Like, the kind of things that those I-beams can blast through is a fairly large list, and it can do a ton of damage. So I like how this kid is basically being handed a portable, infinite ammo rocket launcher, a rough equivalent. Because that's basically what it is, and I do like how his powers and their significant strength were useful several times throughout the course of the movie. So here's my note about Storm. I kind of already talked to her a bit. I talked about how weak she is. I do have a question about Storm, other than her being cool. No pun intended. The X-Men trilogy, as we see it here, First Class, Days of Future Past, and Apocalypse, all three of them have several concurrent threads going through them, and that's the fact that your power can get stronger over time. That was actually a fairly major point in First Class, actually. That a power, towards the beginning, Erik had to concentrate quite a bit to keep the coin going. Later on, he would gain the ability to carry a submarine. And it was a big moment, not just because it's cool that he's carrying that submarine, but because it showed how far he had gotten, how strong he had become, and how much more he was willing to push himself. That'll become relevant later, too, but I have an interesting question here. How much of the empowering that is being done to these mutants is done by Apocalypse? How do I put this? The question is, did Apocalypse just jumpstart their power? In other words, fast forward the growth process, if you will, the strengthening of the muscle. Or did he actually imbue some of his own power into them? Because Lord knows he has quite a bit to go around. I don't have any answers here. I leave the question for you guys. But I will note that both Storm and Psylocke do still seem to have their power levels after Apocalypse is atomized. So, I do like how Apocalypse's return is quite literally felt by every one of the major character points throughout the world. A fairly large and major energy spike that also triggers an earthquake. So some people feel the earthquake, some people feel the energy spike. It also triggers Phoenix. If you pay attention to the dialogue, they never say it outright, but she always had, the same issues any psychic person would have up until that moment. And from that moment on, all of a sudden she starts having Phoenix-related powers. Worse than it's ever been before. This is much more real, blah, blah, blah. Wouldn't it be absolutely hilarious and very appropriately, I'd say ironic, if Apocalypse actually woke up the Phoenix? It also would make sense to me. There are very, very, very few things on Earth. In fact, I would argue within the setting of the movies alone, there's only one thing on the Earth that is actually strong enough to wake up the Phoenix. And that's Apocalypse himself. I like Xavier's optimism. He shows it throughout. It's actually one of the big parts of First Class, too. I had a discussion with a friend once about how the only way someone could ever reach Erik Lehnsherr after all the garbage he's been through, and I mean just physical and mental and emotional torture, is if you embraced him with just basically unconditional love. I know you shippers are all making fun, but you know what I mean. That kind of boundless capacity for caring. I actually do care about you, and demonstrating it repeatedly. That is Charles Xavier in these three movies in a nutshell. And I find myself wondering how much worse this world would be if he was not in it, ignoring the fact that I've read the Age of Apocalypse comics. So here's a question for you. How many of you liked the Erik Lehnsherr scenes before he basically becomes Magneto again? I ask that because I'm of mixed mind on them. The actual critical scene where the tragedy happens, that hit me. It was easy for that to hit me. Someone basically pointed a gun at my head and said, "Feel sad, damn it!" It was very blunt and very overt. And, I have a niece who's 4. It's not hard to be sad at that scene, and I did cry during this replay of it. But the build-up to that was, I'm just going to give my opinion here, terrible. It was too broadcast. It was too obvious. They actually used different glow filters on the camera for the scenes to show just how beatific, how heavenly life was with his wife and with his child. And it's just like, oh my God. And even in the theater when I was seeing this for the first time, I'm like, oh God, they're going to kill them. They're going to kill them so he can become Magneto again. Now, my first biggest complaint is that it was too obvious. It was like someone walking up to that scene had literally a big old neon sign saying, "We're gonna kill him! We're gonna kill him! Tragedy in 10!" My second big complaint about it is it was unnecessary. The tragedy was unnecessary. I'm serious. The point of the tragedy was to convince Erik Lehnsherr to become Magneto again, and to kind of lead into the whole family thing, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but I don't really think that was necessary, because he already lost his family because he was too weak to save them. Remember? We know about that. That's already a thing. So, the idea of having to kill off his family again, I don't think that's necessary, personally. I don't think that's the only method you can do to make him a bad guy again. Especially a bad guy who you know is going to come back to the good guy's side. Why not have any of the other dozens of reasons you could do that? I'm not going to list them all. I've decided not to. This is probably already going to be long enough video as is. But seriously, there are other methods than just tragedy and check it off of a checklist. There are now. So now that I've said all of that, also while I'm on the subject, you could just call out the fact that he's got a lot of baggage anyways, or maybe have his family be kidnapped in order to be used against him. I mean, there's so many ways you could go about this without actually having to kill him. I'm sorry, I hate to keep bashing that point in, but I really felt it was an unnecessary thing. But that leads me to two questions. I really liked pretty much everything except for the accidental killing of the wife and child. I really did. Other than that one little tidbit, it was brilliantly acted, brilliantly directed, brilliantly presented. The cops are very interesting. The way they're portrayed, the way they're talking. Are they actually afraid of him? Do they think he should be brought to justice? Are they biased against mutants? Or against people who are not like them? And that last point, you notice how one of them actually shouts out, and they make sure we hear this, she's one of them! There are very few circumstances when you could, in a sort of derogatory tone, say them and not be admitting your own bias. Or maybe they were just afraid. And yet I can't help but point out that the reason Erik Lehnsherr was sold out to the cops was because he saved a man's life. That little tidbit I think was very well done, because that is exactly on point. I have lived amongst you for years, enough time to have a wife and a child and a family and friends and neighbors. I've got a regular job in a steel mill, haha. And yet, despite all of that, I use my powers, save someone's life, and that's what causes them to rat him out, and that's what causes the cops to come after him. Think about that. I will also point out, as I'm sure Erik himself is aware of, he had access to metal. I don't mean like under the surface of the earth or the stuff he could pull off later on. I mean, she had her locket with him. His wife came with the locket or maybe it was his daughter. But anyway, there was the locket there. Furthermore, this is Magneto. It wouldn't be hard for him to just carry around a little bit of metal on him. We've seen he doesn't need a lot to kill a whole group of people. He does it with a locket. So, I'm not saying this is bad writing. I'm saying Erik had to have been hurting himself inside because he wasn't thinking like that. He wasn't thinking like a killer or a combatant. He was thinking like a husband and a father. It wasn't until those two roles were taken away from him that he was left reverting to murdering all of those people there. Did they deserve it? That's not something I'm willing to place judgment on. I have no idea. It was a very messed up situation. And it brings up my next question. So, I want you to pay attention to something if you ever rewatch this film after listening to me say this. Watch their expressions. Watch how they act after they accidentally kill the wife and child. Despite the bias, despite the prejudice, despite whatever may or may not exist there, they are horrified at what happened. There is something very real. It's easy to look at someone and say, you're less than me, or you're one of them freaks. Now let's say, just hear me out, by some freak accident you actually kill one of those people. That's different. While the human mind is more than capable of some really depraved acts of prejudice and violence, a normal human mind, a normal person's mind, that does something like that will snap. That's just a whole nother tier of whoa! And they act that very well. Props to the actors. They are in utter shock. It would have been too easy to write them of just, oh God, we gotta run. But they don't. They are too mortified at what has happened. They are too terrified at what they've done. They are in utter and complete shock. And so they don't even have time to realize that they're being killed. That was brilliant. Here's the question. Should sins be forgiven? Now, I'm not going to give my answer to this because that's irrelevant. We all have to decide this for ourselves. But it is a question that has come up more than a few times in life, and especially in fiction. Let's say a character does some horrible feats. Let's say they try to redeem themselves from the feats. Should they be allowed to? Assuming the redemption attempt is genuine, should they be allowed to? There are people who believe, genuinely, that it doesn't matter what you do after. What matters is what you did. You should be punished or killed because of what you did. Some people think that there should always be a chance at redemption, assuming the attempt is real. Some people believe something in the middle. I bring this up because that is very much Erik Lehnsherr's arc in this movie. Should he be redeemed for what he did as Magneto? Should he be allowed such a thing? Now, if I'm going to be 100% blunt, I think the movie goes way overboard in redeeming him. But at the moment towards the beginning of the movie, when he was Erik Lehnsherr in the shirt and then the jeans, I think that man, just my opinion, should be allowed the possibility of redemption. But it's clear that other people don't think that. I also find it interesting how he was willing to go into custody and most likely be executed just to save his wife and child. After all, what could there be more important to Erik Lehnsherr than saving his family? Speaking of which, another way you could have gotten around that, he could have just gone in, been captured. Humans are going to execute him. His wife and child, yeah, you could add something there if you want to about them being prejudiced, having to leave, kicked out of the city, that kind of a thing. Pariahs. Apocalypse just shows up one day in his cell. Hi. Don't worry, you're not going to be executed. Come with me. Just another thought there. Now let me say one other thing I really like about this movie, and that's its portrayal of Apocalypse's powers. One of the hardest things I've ever had to answer, I know this sounds weird, is what are Apocalypse's mutant powers? And that's always such a hard question to answer because there's never, to my knowledge, been a really defined he has blasts coming out of his eyes kind of a thing like there are for most mutants. Now, we know now, thanks to the way Apocalypse's story has gone and the second age of Apocalypse that happened and all that fun stuff, that that's on purpose because of the whole tech he had from the Celestials and all that fun stuff. But in this movie, he does have a array of powers thanks to all those he's stolen. But the one power they demonstrate the best, the one power I really liked, was atomic restructuring. The moment I saw him do that, I was just like, yes! And Sis is like, what? And I'm like, that's his power. He can atomically restructure things. And she understood what that meant, and the depths of what that meant. And she's just like, oh my god. And I'm like, yeah! That's Apocalypse! That's great! That's awesome that he has that kind of power. I really do like that. Now, here's another interesting question for you. Again, I'm just going to move forward through the scenes here. First of all, I love the continued usage of Time Stop by Charles Xavier. Great thing. Everybody take a break. I laughed out loud. His awkwardness around Moira is fantastic. But the question I have for you is, was he given level 5 clearance or did he take it? I ask that because he did work with the CIA. He was government funded for a while there and government backed. It is possible he actually was given level 5 clearance. But given several things, including the fact that he didn't want anyone to know he was even there, I think it's a little more likely he took level 5 clearance. Kind of I want to make sure I have access to things in case I need it. It is also possible he doesn't have level 5 clearance, he just has the ability to control people's minds. Apocalypse says an interesting line, very interesting line to Storm. I have come to, and he hesitates, thinking of the word, and then he says, cleanse the world. He says that in Arabic, I believe. But then when asked what he means, he clarifies and says, I want to save the world. Now, I find that to be actually surprisingly interesting scene and a great insight into his mindset. Because that is Apocalypse's mindset right there, isn't it? Cleansing is saving in his mind. It is better. It is what is good for him to wipe out millions or billions of lives. He thinks so little of them, but I don't want to get off on Apocalypse just yet. I just thought that was a very interesting little touch there. So I like Caliban. I like how he's portrayed. It's also very logical, the idea of there being an undermarket with political connections. Human beings make political connections all the time. Corporations, businesses, and family units, and neighboring areas. The very idea of a homeowners association is an example of politics. Never mind governments and whatnot, and interest groups, all that fun stuff. So it is very logical to me that mutants would make their own little political entities and try to do something with them in order to further their own agendas or their own kind. And Caliban is a great example of that, the kind of person who has several mutants working under his employ, all working for the same general purpose, the idea of information trading and, smuggling mutants. I like that. It was a nice touch. Also, I already mentioned this, but my note here literally says, Psylocke fully powered up? Holy hell, that's awesome! And she's out of the movie. I mean, again, she has like the 2 more scenes, but come on, that is such a cool idea. I do think it's cliche. Again, I'm just kind of going through the movie in order here. I do think it's a little bit of a cliche that the first person, or arguably second person, that Scott sees as Jean, but I think it works quite well, especially since, as I mentioned before, the 2 of them have a lot in common character-wise. The pariah thing. I can't remember the word I used, but whatever, the thing earlier. I also like Scott's desire to help Kurt have fun. The idea of we got to go to a mall. Also, his line, the only thing that's makes us American is that it used to be British. That was a good line. So here's a question for you: why Angel? Why did Psylocke lead Apocalypse to Angel? Now, this can be explained because Angel was a good fighter. But he has wings. I don't mean to be dismissive, but that's it. I want the strongest, the most powerful. Psylocke is not the most powerful. No offense to Psylocke, but she isn't. Neither is Angel. Storm, absolutely. Yeah, Storm can do a lot of power, and so can Magneto. But the other 2 choices, I find myself just going, now I know, Angel was one of the Horsemen, Archangel. I get it. I get where they're going with that arc. They even bothered to have him have the metallic uniform and all that. And it was absolutely horrifying and brilliant the way they showed his spine rebuilding itself through his skin in order to build and support his new metal wings. But why Angel? Here's the most powerful mutants. But that ties into something I'll talk about later regarding the Horsemen. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So, I mentioned this during my discussion. I got chills when I saw Magneto, having just buried his wife and child, entering a steel mill, or an iron mill, or whatever. It doesn't matter, it's magnetic. We know that, we've seen that. So, that's just one of those, oh god, they are all so screwed. Like, that's dread kind of a feeling there. And the way he so calmly, I shouldn't say calmly, the way he so matter-of-factly tells them that all of your loved ones are now going to know what it's like to permanently lose someone. He doesn't say, like I have, but it's very much implied there. That was a very powerful scene, and you could kind of tell, especially by the way he approaches Apocalypse, don't stop me from killing these men. You could kind of tell that he was trying to talk himself into it. That he still didn't quite have the killer mindset again. That he was still thinking like a husband and a father. That he didn't want to do this. There's this great line, I wrote it down somewhere. Here it is. Is this what you want from me? Is this what I am? That was a very powerful scene. You can tell in that scene that Erik doesn't want to be Magneto. He doesn't want to be this horrible mass-murdering bastard. As much as he probably does believe in the whole supremacy thing, he has learned what a normal life feels like, and he liked it. He keeps saying later on that I tried it your ways, Charles, and it didn't work. And while that is true, that's also not true at the same time. Those cops, those people in the steel mill, base fear and suspicion and all the other things that come up that are a negative side of all humans, mutant or otherwise, was what caused the horrible tragedy at that in the scriptwriters. He actually tried Charles' way, and it actually worked, and he liked it for a while. So it's interesting to see him trying to make that transition. I also like how Apocalypse steals him. Don't stop me from killing these men. I wonder if Psylocke told Apocalypse about Erik's past, or if Apocalypse just sensed it. But there's three things actually, that I really like about the upcoming scene, the scene at Auschwitz and just before it. First of all, Erik Lehnsherr, and I'm using that name on purpose. I'm trying very hard to be specific about when I call him Erik and when I call him Magneto. Erik Lehnsherr he looks like hell. He's wearing like a loose linen shirt with an undershirt and some jeans and some, Dockers or whatever. He looks like crap. Sneakers, not Dockers. And I like that. It serves as a wonderful contrast because when the other three show up, they're in uniform. Storm has her new outfit. Psylocke has her iconic outfit. Angel has his mostly armored look going for him. Apocalypse, of course, has his robes and all that. And his technology. I'll bring that up later. Erik just looks like a guy. The contrast is striking, especially since Magneto is pretty much stronger than the other three combined, could probably best the other three combined, could probably even threaten Apocalypse himself. For those of you who haven't read the comics, big spoiler for a series that came out in the 90s, the one who finally actually killed Apocalypse in the original Age of Apocalypse storyline was Magneto. It took almost all of his power to do it, and he basically died right after, but he did it. Second thing I want to mention about that scene, maybe it's just me, but I hear just a tiny tone of regret when Apocalypse, when Erik's like, where were you when my parents were killed? And he says, I wasn't here, I was asleep. He doesn't say I'm sorry. That wouldn't be in his character. But I hear that tiny tone of regret, and I think about it, and everything we know about Apocalypse's character as presented in this movie makes it think there is real regret there. But not for not being there for his parents. For not being there in general. I'll talk more about that later. I keep saying that. Finally, here's an interesting question for you. Apocalypse clearly and demonstrably powers up Psylocke, Storm, and Angel, right? Does he power up Magneto? Think about it. Rewatch the scene if you want. I rewatched it twice just to get my own thoughts in it. My sister and I both agree that he didn't. Now, it's possible he did. Totally. I mean, he kind of amplifies Charles later, too. It's not like Apocalypse doesn't have this demonstrable ability that he uses all the time to power up mutants. Sure, that's not my point. From a narrative perspective, I think it fits a lot better if Apocalypse didn't. Because that means all he did was convince him to use the power he already had. Just like Charles did back in First Class. You remember that scene? Where he reaches out to him and he's like, will you accept my brain, and me invading your brain? He asks permission, in other words. And then he tries to teach him how to try and to use his power more. And I mentioned earlier, the culmination of him being able to lift that submarine. That was a big feat for him at the time. Later on, his powers went up even more. There was no Apocalypse involved in that. Again, this trilogy makes it clear your powers do grow over time. I think it makes more sense that he just encouraged him to reach out with all the rage and pain, just like he did all those years ago, and use that to really reach the full potential. And by the way, I just want to gush about the special effects of Magneto's powers. The way they are presented visually with the actual magnetic lines and the swirls was awesome and perfect. It's the first time I felt like I was actually watching Magneto's powers, actually, just like I mentioned earlier. One of the most interesting things about the two mindsets that are portrayed within this trilogy is that both are right, really. On the one side, you have the significant pacifism and optimism of Charles, and on the other side, you have the rather pessimism but also pragmatism of Erik. Both of them are right in their own way. Charles wants to see the best in people. Erik wants to be prepared for a war. Now, you could argue where they actually sit in the different parallels, but the actual perspectives, regardless of the two entities, are you always have to be ready to fight, and you never have to be ready to fight, is really what that boils down to. It's not quite pacifism on this side, and it's not quite aggressiveness on this side. It's an interesting dichotomy. And again, I find the most interesting thing as I was going through this one is that both sides have their own correct perspective. We see that in Beast. We see that in Hank. We see that in Hank. We see that in Raven. there are several characters who present one side or the other, or kind of an in-between, of these two philosophies. So there is then an extremely powerful scene, a very, very, very powerful scene, between Erik and Charles, where Charles reaches out through Cerebro, touches his mind. He's like, hello, old friend. And the very next thing is he almost breaks down into sobbing tears, as that grief and pain is still so fresh in Eric's mind, just right there on the surface. And the first thing out of his, I am so sorry, I am so sorry. Oh my God, I'm just overwhelmed by the tragedy of it. And his first instinct is not to lecture him or to speechify at him, even though he does do both things. His first instinct is to simply embrace him, to basically hug him mentally, and say, I'm here for you, my friend. I am so sorry. Because that's Charles. Now, back at the time, I want to say the timing of this movie's pacing is actually interesting. It goes fastest in the middle, and there's a really big stall point I haven't gotten to yet, and then it picks up pace yet again. But Apocalypse has basically been teleporting around, grab, gets Erik, destroys Auschwitz, goes here, gets prepped for the next step. Then the Cerebro incident happened, and then Apocalypse has that line, "Thank you for letting me in." And then Apocalypse basically piggybacks. I love this scene because it makes sense that someone with his powers would be able to use Cerebro to connect the connection back, and then use that to control everyone in the world who happens to be in control of the nukes, and launch all of them. Now, I've heard the question several times, and when I was first seeing this in the theater, I thought he was going to nuke the world. And I actually thought they were going to go that way with it. They didn't, but that would be very Age of Apocalypse, wouldn't it? They didn't, but in hindsight, I think that better fits his character. Again, I'll get to that, I swear. But one thing I have to point out, this movie is set in the 80s, early to mid-80s. Now, if you don't know what I mean by that, the Cold War was kind of winding down by then. It wasn't as immediate and apparent as it was in, say, the previous 2 decades. But it was still there. I don't know how to explain what it would be like to look out, to try and imagine for a moment what it would be like to live in an era where nuclear war is a real, everyday threat, and to look out your window and see nukes being launched. That scene had a lot of power for me, personally. So, and then they trick them into destroying the facility. Quick thing, real quick. I rewatched the Quicksilver Saves Everyone scene several times, but I especially watched the beginning of it like 3 times because I wanted to check something. Upon rewatching it, they did lay the groundworks for Havoc dying. The explosion has actually engulfed where he was standing by the time Quicksilver even gets down there. So Havoc was gone before Quicksilver had a chance to even save him. I actually like that. Not only does it help to push Scott's character forward, but it's so, like, it just happens, and it's like, here's this big, amazing scene of awesome, and by the way, he died. I like that whiplash of the way that's presented, and the fact that, in the moment, even the characters don't have really time to process it until they are imprisoned on the helicopter, and that's when Scott finally starts to break down, as it starts to seep in, because that's how we work as people. If someone you loved, forgive me, died in front of you right now, your immediate reaction will not be, oh my God, oh my God. I'm sorry, it wouldn't. There would be disbelief, shock. You wouldn't... speaking from experience. You wouldn't be sure what to feel at first. For a bit, you would literally not believe it was happening. Like, you would start to question what you saw, what you heard. It takes a little bit of time for it to sink in. It takes a little bit of time for it to get to that point where you actually realize the truth of what you already know. That's when it really hits you. And it made sense that it was structured that way, and I liked that. I'm going to say what everyone else on the internet has said. The Quicksilver scene was awesome. Like, even people who make fun of this movie and say it's stupid loved the Quicksilver scene. Really, it was great. I cannot praise it enough. There's so much that went into it, and it was expensive and awesome and amazing. The end. I'm not just going to gush about it. But I do have to say 2 interesting points. First of all, it is interesting to me that Quicksilver is presented as still being arrogant at this point. And that makes sense. He has not had to try at anything, ever. Even when he went in to break Magneto out, from a government prison built just for him. That was child's play to him. He just was like, yeah, I got this. He's never had to try. And he shows that as he's going throughout the mansion. He's not trying. He's having fun with it. He's playing around with it. That's part of his character arc. It's very small, but it is there. The idea that Quicksilver starts to recognize that he is, in his own words, a loser. Someone who is basically just lackabouting around, lying on the laurels of his powers, not really developing them. Imagine what a Quicksilver who's really skilled and practiced could do. Second point I want to bring out. Based on how we see the explosion and how little time it took for the explosion to happen, most of those people would have died without ever realizing it. It's just quietly horrifying, really, when you think about it. Imagine just being like, da-da-da-da-da, and then you're dead. There's no moment of shock. There's no, just you're dead. A lot of those people would have never seen it coming. Although the couple kissing on the roof, that might have been a relief given how he was. Don't tongue, okay? Don't go. So, my next point here literally just says, God damn it, Stryker. Ugh. First of all, screw Stryker. I'm actually upset he lived through this movie. I get it. I'm also upset that the electric field thing works. I'll talk about that in a little more detail in just a second. I get that it's necessary, because if they didn't have a way to nullify their powers, then they would never present a threat. I do want to point out something, just in the middle here, because the scenes jump about a bit. I like how the moment Charles wakes up, he realizes his powers aren't working, that they're being blocked, basically. And then he immediately transitions into using his words to try and convince them of his side. I mention that because it just shows how an everyday part of his life his powers have become. It's a little thing, but it's a nice way of demonstrating it. They do the similar thing with Raven, not too long after, pretty much the next scene, actually. She wakes up, and before her eyes are even fully open, she's shifted back into her human disguise. That is how normal it has become to her to exhibit her powers, to shift. Remember, she has to actively will that to happen. If she's relaxed or unconscious, she's Mystique. She doesn't stay in the form she's in. She reverts whenever she's not actively projecting it. And yet, while not even fully awake, she immediately shifts. It was a nice touch. God damn it, Stryker. So let's talk about the next scene. I have a note here saying, I hate to nitpick, but... ... How did the trio who was in the helicopter get out to help them? How did Stryker have the ability to know there was a psychic event and to track it? Why did he not specifically look for Xavier? And in fact, why did he not stick around, even knowing that Xavier had been there? Because that's how he tracked him, right? And there's a few others. I'm not actually going to go over the whole list. There's one that really bothers me. Really bothers me, though. All of these previous questions could be answered. They're kind of nitpicky, and I mentioned before, a movie doesn't have to show anything. It just has to show you this much. A lot of these feel kind of plot-holy, though. Much more so than most of the other things in this film, to me personally. And the reason why is because this is unnecessary. This whole sequence is unnecessary. Blow up the thing, Quicksilver's there, oh my god, what do we do? CIA comes in, we know, and then the message goes out. And then we go out to Egypt. You could shift smoothly, and the pacing wouldn't suffer at all between those two scenes. But instead, we have this massive, 10-minute or 12-minute jump in the middle of just, hey, it's Wolverine. Because that's why that scene is there. I'm just going to tell you right now. That scene exists because, hey, it's Wolverine. And it goes on way too long, and it doesn't serve any other purpose other than, hey, it's Wolverine. Now, I get it. Franchise building. They wanted Wolverine to escape, and they wanted to show that for some reason. And Hugh Jackman likes playing Wolverine, and that's fine. But for me, if I was doing my own edited version of this, I would just chop out that entire chunk of the movie. Especially because the thing that bothers me most about this movie from a nitpicky perspective is in those scenes. I actually referenced this earlier. What the hell's with the electricity thing? Twice in this movie, electricity is just somehow an anti-mutant thing, and works inconsistently, I feel like adding. They're in this helicopter with an electrical field turned on, and all of a sudden their powers cease to exist. No I-beams, no mental abilities, no teleportation. just shut off somehow. Now, I know some people are going to argue in defense of that, and that's fine. To me, it's ridiculous that something so simple, invented in the 80s, can be just an anti-mutant thing. Just literally a switch to turn it off. And it was earlier in the movie, too. Here's a question for you. Why can Nightcrawler, who can teleport anywhere he's seen, or anywhere he knows where it is, can't get out of a cage? Well, the answer given is because it's electrified. As if the electric fields prevent his teleportation. Even though we actually have a scene in this movie, once ever, it's a great shot, which shows how his teleportation works from the first-person perspective. It's just like it was in the comics, basically. It's dimensional shifting. The fact that the electric field is basically just a magic wand to turn off the mutant powers bothers me, is what I'm trying to say. I get why it exists. I don't like it. I do like exactly one thing about the Wolverine scene, and that's Stryker crapping his pants. He's in shock. He is in utter shock. Oh god, oh god. You get the impression that he'd gone through a lot of work and effort to get Weapon X under control, and it's all just, oh god, it's going to hell, it's going to hell. I'll be right back. And then he abandons his men, flees for his life. It's a nice touch. So, we're going to skip forward a little bit. I have to admit, when I was watching Magneto destroy the world, it's a fairly neat effect. And again, I love the way they visually present his magnetic powers. It's great. But in the theater and when rewatching it, all I could think was, God, how many people are dying right now? How many lives are being destroyed by the collateral damage right now? Holy hell. I mentioned earlier that whole redemption thing. I'm all for Erik Lehnsherr being redeemed. I am. But what he did towards the end of the film is insane in scope and scale. He was going to be being an extinction level event. And he killed a lot of people. And he did it willingly and knowingly. It's not like there was some alien possessing him. It's not like he was another individual or whatever. He did that. And then he's just, oh, I'm on the good guy's side now. Everything's forgiven. I'm all for redemption, but, I mean, come on. I do find it a pity that Quicksilver does not confess to Magneto, excuse me, about who he is, ever, in general, but especially at the point where he is there, because this is the moment when Erik Lehnsherr's character arc finishes its full arc. When he finally realizes... Raven hits him full tilt with it, right in the face. You have never had the power to save your family, but now you do. For the first time ever, you finally can actually help your family. When you were a child, your powers were not developed enough, and you didn't have the ability to fight off, the Nazi horribleness. And in the previous scene, well, we're not going to go into that. Now you do. You can finally use your powers for something other than killing and murdering. You can actually try to help, to save. And I have to point out, it was a really nice touch at the end to show Erik and Jean, both of whose power are always so afraid and using their powers as a weapon, as tools of destruction and killing, are both using their powers to rebuild the damage done. It was a nice touch, very obvious in its symbology, but it was a nice touch. I really love the Charles fight with Apocalypse. It made a lot of sense, actually, especially that scene, you want what I've got, and you get the impression as he's doing that he is showing Apocalypse all the pain of all the people's minds he's touched over the years. Think about how much pain Charles Xavier has felt from other people over his lifetime. Yeah. Now, I do actually really like the end thing. I like the fact that all of them unite together against Apocalypse, and I like the fact that it's not enough. I do. I like the fact that even though Charles is fighting him within, the place where Charles is strongest, and even though Magneto and Cyclops and Storm are all fighting him without, that it's not enough, that Apocalypse is just that strong. That when all the chips are down and he stopped playing around and he stopped pissing all over things, he's finally started to take this seriously for the first time in the whole movie. He bests all of them. Except for one. Let's talk about Apocalypse. Now, what I'm about to tell you is mostly my interpretation, but after rewatching it, I'm firmly convinced, in my opinion. Sorry. Apocalypse is a hypocrite. Sabah is a massive hypocrite. Here's a theory, supported by the movie, but pure theory, okay? I don't think he's a mutant. Or at least, to be more accurate, I don't think he is a natural mutant. I don't think he was born a mutant. And the reason I say that is because for me that fits narratively his character so perfectly. He is so anti-tools, so anti-systems. He is so arrogant and superior, and yet he shows in many cases that he doesn't think mutants are superior. He thinks he is superior. He doesn't give a good goddamn about any of his other mutants. He shows himself rather blatantly. The way he reacts to Archangel is a great example of this. But he does this several times in the final scene. When he stops playing around, like I said. When he finally starts taking this seriously again, we see the real Apocalypse. And it's not a fun, kind, nice, interesting person. Or, excuse me, it is actually interesting. It is a horrible monster underneath there. This is someone who does not give a good goddamn about anything. All his talks about his survival of the fittest and my children and all that crap was a pack of lies. Now, all of what I just said is true except for the him not being a mutant part. It is also possible that he originally had the mutant ability to switch bodies with someone. But I don't think that's true either. We've seen, well, it's very, very clearly made that he needs the technology to do that. He needs a tool to do that. The man who is so arrogantly presumptive, no more spears, needs a tool to function. I think he invented mutants. I'm serious. Whether it's celestial technology or stuff that he came upon himself or whatever, I think he invented mutation, first in himself, and then he slowly took it from others as he would basically make more mutants with more powers and then harvest them. And then he would get stronger. And then and over time he gained more and more abilities, like the ability to atomically restructure, like the ability to empower, bring up another mutant's power level. You know, all these different things that he can do were things he gained. His ability to block mentally, his ability to actually control mentally is what he wanted from Charles. This is probably the clearest, distinct note that he is a massive hypocrite. His whole thing about the survival of the fittest and my true children, my goddess, all of that is a giant pack of lies, because what he wants more than anything else is a world of him. No one and nothing else. He wants to have his mind in everyone else's mind, and no one else. He wants a world, someone who claims he wants the survival of the fittest, wants a world of total stagnation. Because there's no one better than him. I have a note here. I wonder if there's any self-loathing in him. I mentioned the nuke scene. You remember that? Is it self-loathing that causes him to get rid of these tools? Is it a degree of self-preservation because he knows a nuke could actually threaten him? Or is it just more of him being a horrible person? How dare you? How dare you make these tools that can equate to me? How dare you try to reach up and touch my throne? How dare you think you to be my equal? You are beneath me. I want to give praise to Oscar Isaacs, excuse me. It's very difficult for him to act. I've seen his interviews. He had a lot of trouble with the 40-pound suit and the humidity and the heat, but he does a really good job of it. I like his acting, and I like his portrayal of Sabah a lot. He does a lot of things. I've just got a few other notes here. Note the first person he latches onto. The first person that shows any interest to him at all is a mutant. He looks around, he's just like, wow, here's a bunch of crap. Oh, there's a mutant. Immediately his expression changes. Everything before that, he's just like, he's got like this look as if he stepped in something or he smells something weird. Then he sees Storm. He sees Aurora, and he's like, mutant. Something that matters. Something that I care about. Something that matters to me. This is another reason I think he built mutants, by the way. That's also a theory. I think he designed and built the first mutants, and then because he went away, the whole mutation thing just kind of faded into the history of genetics, and it took the escalative process, which I forget the actual proper name of, in genetics for that to be brought forward in the more recent century. But I think he designed them, and so he sees something. Would make sense that she would be interested to him, not just because she's a mutant, because she's one of his mutants. Because she's a mutant. The fact that there is a mutant still here means some aspect of his legacy lives on. Note his absolute disgust at Archangel. I referenced that scene earlier, but it is a very important scene because it just so amplifies his mentality. He doesn't actually care about anyone other than himself, and that's very clear. But it shows that his whole survival of the fittest thing, this is again my opinion, is just about all the little ants around him and him. So this brings me to the Four Horsemen. I'll talk about them in just a moment. All the little ants around him serve no purpose other than to compete against each other to see the strongest, and only the strongest of the ants are fit to carry his throne. That is how above them he considers themselves. I hate to quote just the TV show of all things, but I am as far beyond mutants as they are beyond you, speaking to a normal human. Given what Apocalypse can do and the massive amount of power he has, and again, we see that at the end of the film. He shows off exactly what he can do, full tilt. Why does he need the Horsemen at all? Well, I kind of gave you one of my answers. He wants the strongest ants. He wants the best trophies to carry him around. Metaphorically, of course. But there's a couple other options there. It could be something other than pure ego. He could have done it for so many years, and kind of became a tradition and a habit, as a way to enforce his rule politically. Remember, he got stronger over time. And he was able to be basically overthrown because he had a moment of weakness. He would die every now and again. He would age, and he needed to take a new body. So that means he has two weak points. One, he needs someone else to operate the machinery. And two, he needs a political infrastructure to provide an industrial infrastructure to build and produce these machines in order to make this happen. At least until he got his atomic restructuring thing. But you get my point. When he's on that slab, he is incredibly weak and vulnerable. That's why they chose then to try and strike him. And they nearly killed him. Or at the very least, severely inconvenienced him. So, I think that to some extent he needed the Horsemen. They were more tools to him. Especially if he actually built the mutation into them, or into humans in general, and then uplifted certain humans. And I hate to point this out, but it would also be an excellent way to maintain control. I've talked about this many times before. I think most recently it was actually when we were going through Minecraft story mode, of all things. If you have a group of slaves, one of the best ways to control that group of slaves is to give them status above the other slaves. If you're good, if you do what I say, if you obey me, like a good, trustworthy, loyal soldier does, I will uplift you above the other slaves. And now you can lord it over them. It would be an excellent way for Apocalypse to maintain control, wouldn't it? And that's hinted at because it's very light there, but it's hinted that he has had people betray him many, many, many times. In the beginning of the film, they mentioned that every time he culls a civilization. I don't think that's 100% true. I think it's more likely that each time he is betrayed, he decides to destroy that civilization out of ego, out of pride, and of course, out of a need to make sure that the masses know their place. That's his retribution, not culling, not cleansing. In other words, I don't think Apocalypse actually believes in the survival of the fittest at all. I think it's a complete lie that he feeds his people. Now, this brings up the best part of the movie, in my opinion. Well, one of the best. The Phoenix. Of course it takes the Phoenix to beat Apocalypse. Charles Xavier and Magneto combining their powers can accomplish insane things. But even they, fighting at the same time, unified in purpose, could not even slow him down. En Sabinor is just that much better than them. And I love the fact that when he sees Phoenix, everything about his presentation, his character arc, again, props to Oscar Isaacs, changes. All of the sudden, he says, you could see on his face. Now, my sister and I have interpreted this many ways, and I'd love to hear your guys' interpretations. My interpretation, her interpretation was that that she just took off his tools and then he was killed. Now, that if you look at the sequence of events, that is how that happens. His machinery that he relies on, and it's demonstrated several times he relies on that machinery, especially at the beginning, his tools, that machinery is stripped away from him by Phoenix, and then everyone else's powers basically kill him in combination with the Phoenix. It was the one thing that could overwhelm that celestial tech, or whatever it actually is. My interpretation was slightly different. That he was still fighting until he saw Phoenix, and with his power and his knowledge and his insight and everything he could see mentally and physically, he saw a mutant that was stronger than him. And he stopped fighting quite as hard. In other words, his final quote, "All is revealed," is that he realizes the horrible truth that there is actually someone stronger than him, and that sort of dawning realization of, oh my God, there really is a stronger mutant than me. Given it's beautifully ironic from a narrative perspective, because that would mean the philosophy he didn't believe in, the philosophy he faked all this time, had suddenly proven to be real, that the fittest survived, and it wasn't him. I love that scene. There's several different layers of how you can interpret it. It could also be that he had that revelation, but he was still fighting back, and then Phoenix stripped the machinery. Or it could be the fact that Phoenix just overpowered him and there's nothing he can do about it. There's a lot of ways you could look at that. But either way, I thought that was a great overall cap to the movie. So, I guess that's all I've got, guys. Hope you'll forgive me for my short rumination. And I'll see you guys next time.